We're into, I guess, our fifth week, I believe, of working closely with teams. And we're talking about principles that I believe that we can be called to as a church to live by and live into so that we can work better together. This passage, of course, as you heard, I think works very well with working in teams and the very nature of Christian teamwork and working closely with one another according to the principles and values that we see reflected in God and Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. We're talking this morning about investing in one another's success. Investing in one another's success. My guess is if you have any sort of financial investments, you at least pay somebody who's an expert to invest and follow those funds for you. You probably don't just invest monetary gifts into a stock or a mutual fund and then just never look at it, especially probably nearing retirement. You probably want to know how that means of financial health is doing for you and helping you towards your retirement if you have such a plan. So we're talking about investing in one another's success. And I just want to call your attention and finally explain the half-point font that we have on the front of our bulletin. It's purposely small, and we've arrived today as the explanation for it. But I just want to read to you that instructions for use are nothing more than principles for us to live by. These guidelines were established following conversations with current staff and best practices gained from experience. And it goes through and explains each one of those topics that we've talked about this week. IFU, or instructions for use, IFU as it's known for short, is a clean acronym. It actually is something that comes from the medical field. In fact, if you are someone who's works in the medical field or as a nurse or a physician or certainly a surgeon, almost every medical product has this IFU, this instructions for use, that doctors are expected to know along with all the other things before they go into surgery. In fact, the reason I know this is that because my last place of employment before ministry was actually as a medical device sales representative. I worked for a women's healthcare company, and my job, believe it or not, was to call on OBGYNs and try to get them to use my product for medical surgery. And just imagine, if you will, for a moment, someone who went to medical school, and maybe they went to medical school they got out of medical school and residency 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even perhaps 30 years ago or longer. Well, as you know, with many of our technologies evolve and new products are introduced. New products arrive on the scene, and what that means is that someone who went to medical school perhaps 10 or 20 years ago had not had the privilege of learning with a particular device that's brand new on the market. And so the job of a medical device representative is oftentimes to fill that gap for a physician and to make sure that within that limited scope of focus that the doctor can rely on the medical device salesperson to know the ins and outs of the product that they're using. They're not in there to fuse somebody's spine back together. That's the job of the surgeon. But that person is there to represent the medical products that physician is using. And so my job was to fill that gap and to know the ins and outs of the machine that I sold that was like $20,000. Crazy, I know. But the machine that I sold, I had to know every single possible thing about that machine. If it malfunctioned, the doctor was going to turn to me and say, "Ryan, what do I do?" And I had to know, because a patient's life and well-being depended on my knowledge and expertise of being able to know not how to put the patient back together again, but to put my equipment back together again. I had to know it. No questions asked. And so this, unfortunately, as you can imagine with physicians, it seemed to me that with all the things to do, making rounds and working 80 hours a week and going to hospitals and calling on patients, the last thing they had time to do was to read instructions for use. And therefore, it meant that they were going to depend, a lot of them, on the expertise and the knowledge of that salesperson. Well, it didn't go so well. 15 months into my employment there, it just wasn't going well. And I had a great product that was priced a lot higher than some competing products in the market, but nevertheless, it didn't go well. And we had a new product that was being launched, and I won't get into all the specifics of it, but that new product especially wasn't going well. But I did have with my kind of primary product line, I did have a new physician who was beginning to use my product. And sometimes how this happens basically is you kind of check with a surgery coordinator, and you would go to these physicians and find out when the surgeon has a case, is what the people call it. And my job was to go to these cases and make sure that they were well supported within that product line. And I knew that there was a physician in a very reputable physician in Knoxville, Tennessee, who had a case scheduled in the afternoon. Well, my first part of the morning was a conference call that had been scheduled with me and my boss. And basically, I thought this Friday morning conference call was just about to review how the week went. Well, when I heard a third person on the phone that morning, I knew that I was in trouble. And that person introduced themselves as the HR, the Human Resources representative. And at that morning, I realized that 5 minutes later, I was out of a job. Beth and I had been married for about a couple months. I'd kind of gotten put on notice, and that morning I was fired out of a job, I think a month into our marriage. And so what I thought was kind of a strategic phone call wound up being a firing phone call, and it really caught me by surprise. I guess it shouldn't have, but I just didn't expect it to happen that morning in that particular way. Well, I had a case scheduled with this new physician that afternoon. And I thought, what do I do? And I don't know that I had the language at the time to think through logically what was at stake. But in retrospect, I realized that I had the chance to invest in the success of a physician who really didn't have a lot of experience with the product that I sold. I realized that I had the chance to think about success beyond my own family. And we'll come back to the story in a little bit later. But I guess spiritually, this was what was at stake for me. Philippians 2:4 reminded me and challenged me that we're supposed to think of someone else's needs ahead of our own. Philippians 2:4 says this: "Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others." Thanks for that. Really hard to do, really easy to read, but really hard to do when we actually think about putting someone else's needs ahead of our own. This is kind of the gist of 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that Paul's speaking about. This is talking about life in the church. And following this is the famous love chapter that's read at many a wedding. But I want you to know that the context for the famous love chapter is the way that we are called to work with and for each other in the spiritual life of the church. And Paul uses this analogy of body parts to make his point. He talks about our feet. He talks about our hands. He talks about our eyes, our senses of hearing, our senses of smelling. And then he kind of reverses course and again talks about eyes, hands, and feet. And he reminds us that some body parts work differently from others. In fact, almost all of our body parts work in unique ways. And he uses various analogies to make his point. And the one that comes near and dear to my heart is that of eating. Maybe you can get on board with the analogy of eating. I love eating. Many of you know this. If I'm eating a dessert or ice cream or many of the desserts that were left over from Beth's surprise birthday party last weekend, we're still eating those. I don't know whose idea it was to go out and buy more cake when we already had cake and ice cream, but thank you for that. So we're still working on that. But if I'm going to eat some of those desserts, usually there's a regulator in my body that tells me that I'm done eating, right? And it doesn't come from my tongue. My tongue says yes, but my stomach sometimes says no when I get to a certain point. And so we have to depend not just on our taste buds, not on the things that we enjoy to communicate what's needed in our particular bodies, our individual bodies, but we realize that our stomachs and our tongues must work together. This is something we work on in our home, raising a young child. I think back to years prior, and sometimes we had little upset stomachs, and it didn't seem like we knew when to stop eating. And so a phrase that we practice and hear a lot in our home is tummy says stop. Tummy says stop. My taste buds may say keep going, but I have to listen to my tummy so that my tummy says stop and listen to what my stomach says. That is what you say. That's where I got it from. Thank you. Interactive time this morning. If we depend on our taste buds to regulate without checking our stomach, we can really do harm. We can damage the whole body. Physically, we can overindulge and we can reject the food, the enormous amount of food that we might eat. But Paul's talking about a theological reason that also parallels the physical reason. And he says that just as the body is one and has many members, And all the members of the one body, though many, they are one body. So you are many members of this one body. I don't just mean Calvert City United Methodist Church. I don't just mean members of the United Methodist Church, but I mean members of the universal church, as we recite and affirm in the Apostles' Creed that we said earlier. Basically, this is a really fancy way of explaining a simple truth, and that is that the church is designed to be communal. The church is designed so that we might rely on one another to accomplish our goals together. And specifically, even in our celebrations, in our successes, and also our disappointments and shortcomings, we empathize with one another. And when one of us rejoices, we rejoice with that person. When one of us is down, we are also down with that person, empathizing with them. Specifically related to the first point, if one member is honored, all of us are honored together with it. We all rejoice. This is why it's so important when we have ministries that are successful, or I would suggest even near successful, that we rejoice, that we share in the good work that God blessed us with, that we share in the fruits of our labor. And this was I think back to a Habitat for Humanity house. And when this congregation descended upon a home after years of trying to put things together and years of trying to bring a ministry to its completion, many of you descended upon a home, and we rejoiced around a common table of a newly consecrated home. And we celebrated and concluded that time together with Holy Communion, baked from bread, freshly served from the oven of that home. Many of you had tremendous efforts to see that come to fruition. I thank you for that. And that's living out what Paul is talking about. If one member is honored, we all rejoice together with it. Likewise, if one member suffers, we all suffer together. This is why it's so important for us when we have someone in our congregation who loses a loved one. We oftentimes welcome that family into our space and we serve them a warm meal, because we know that we've been there and we've been the one who's rejoicing. And when it's not us, we share in their emotions and offer to them the opportunity to be in ministry with and for them. It's important. It's a simple gesture, but it's important for us to rejoice with one another and also suffer as one of our own suffers. If one of us grieves, we all do. This is why it's important for us to visit hospitals and those who are in need, visit those persons who we know could be encouraged. And likewise, just as our families grieve, so sometimes do our institutions. If you want to call this an institution, or perhaps a group of believers, Calvert City United Methodist Church, we have some gaps in our ability to serve one another well. We have perhaps some personnel that we've lost over the years, or we have people who once were able to serve and no longer are able to. And so our church sometimes suffers as a result missing pieces. And so I've just thought of 3 practical areas in which our church could benefit from the ministries that maybe you could offer. I call your attention to the insert, and maybe we'll just remind you of some of these. In your insert this morning, there is a part that talks about volunteers needed for nursery. I know that we had, at one point, I don't know when, but we had maybe some paid staff who kept young children in the nursery on Sunday morning. Now, I just want you to imagine that maybe you're somebody who has young children and you get yourself ready and you're counting on somebody to be in the nursery, but for whatever reason, that person can't be there. And then you got your family ready to serve in the nursery. But for whatever reason, you now wanted to come to worship and were planning on being able to do that, but now you become the nursery attendant because nobody's there. That's an area where I've heard some of you say, I wouldn't be willing to be that paid person and be there Sunday in, Sunday out, but I would be willing to serve once a quarter. So that might be an area where you want to offer your gifts and graces. To be honest, I'd love if one of you all preached one Sunday morning and you let me go watch babies in the nursery. I'd be up for that. Because I want to invest in the success of our families with young children. I really think it's that important. No kidding aside, I think it's that important. So maybe 4 times a year, you'd be willing to look at a few slides and make sure you understand what it means to keep children safe, infants safe, in the United Methodist setting, and you might be willing to do that. And if you want to preach, just let me know when. I'll go fill my time down there on a Sunday morning. Over the past couple weeks, we've also had some parents of young people step up and say, you know, I want to fill a gap that we have with our youth. I know this is an important area of ministry and an important age of life when their faith is being formed. And I appreciate those who've stepped forward and are willing to do that. I also want to remind you that one of the things listed in your insert this morning is next Sunday we're planning on taking the youth to the Mayfield Corn Maze. I could use an adult volunteer to be an extra chaperone so that we can allow our young people to have a good time and go and do that. That's something they chose, and so we invite you to be a part of that. Just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, they are in fact one body. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about the opportunity to raise a difficult issue. This morning, we're talking about investing in one another's success. And I realize that we have a couple services here. And I just want to raise perhaps what might be for some of us a difficult issue. Years ago, we used to have one service, and I don't know how many years now. I guess a few years or more. We've had a 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock service. So I preach the same sermon at both times, basically. But sometimes you miss out on the people who are at 11 o'clock service. And likewise, I'll tell the 11 o'clock service the same thing. When we only attend one particular service, it's kind of like we can forget that we're one unified church. And so perhaps I just want to offer an idea. Maybe on your Sabbath Sunday of worship and offering God your praise, maybe you see fit to serve in one particular service while attending and worshiping and being refilled in another. And so I know this may be a little bit challenging or a little bit uncomfortable for some of you, but maybe every now and then you just say, I'm going to go to the 11 o'clock service this Sunday, just to remind myself of our heritage and the worship and maybe how connect with my roots so that I can worship God in a different way. We might switch it up from time to time. And I just want to rephrase Paul's words and use it in context of the 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock service and offer you this. All I did was take Paul's words and substitute. And if someone who attends the 9 o'clock service would say, because I do not attend the 11 o'clock worship, I do not belong to the 11 o'clock service, that would not make it any less a part of the 11 o'clock service. So you're part of our 11 o'clock worship. You're a part of our 11 o'clock worship because we expect you to be invested in the success of all the ministries at this church. And so I want to remind us that the shortcomings of this church, whatever they may be, and there are many, I'm sure, they're not any one person's individually. The budget shortfall that we're projecting to have for 2020, it's not just a matter that needs to be known by the finance team. It's a matter that needs to be known by you all, that we've actually projected. And a lot of times our numbers come in under budget in terms of our expenses. But as it stands right now, we're foreseeing a $30,000 shortfall for next year. That's what we've laid out and what we've identified based on the budget reports that you've brought to us. And looking at our trends with giving, I think you need to know that. Does it mean that that's how it will pan out? We don't know. But we're invested in the success of our ministries and the way to fund those. And so whether we be on the finance team or not, whether we're serving the choir or not, whether we help write sermons or not, whether we're in Sunday school or not, whether we're invested physically in the youth or not, children's ministry, Open Hearts, Center Shot, United Methodist Women, these are our ministries, friends. The successes or failures of this church will not be any one person's, but they'll be ours together. And when I had to figure out on the afternoon in Knoxville, Tennessee, exactly what I was going to do when a patient was laying on a table whose name I did not know, and a doctor who I'd started to become friends with and whose trust I'd begun to earn, I didn't want to violate his trust. But I had a legal conundrum. I didn't know if I was legally breaking the law by going into a surgeon's operating room, because I was technically no longer employed. I didn't really know how that worked. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought about what if I actually said something wrong in the operating room and that there were legal ramifications, like a lawsuit happened from the patient to the physician, and then by extension me, because I wasn't even officially perhaps representing that company anymore. I didn't know. I thought about the things that I wanted to do, and on a March day, I probably could have found a good golf course in East Tennessee to go play. That would have been a lot more fun. But I determined that my best course forward was probably to invest in the success of the physician I'd been working with, even if it meant that my company was no longer invested in my personal financial success. So I actually went. I got fired in the morning, and I went into the physician's operating room that afternoon. And I told the doctor, I said, this might be the last time you see me. And he just said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I got let go. I got let go this morning. And he was surprised. And I stood in the corner, and my equipment did everything it was supposed to do. And the doctor did everything he was supposed to do. And I'm sure that patient's success, her life was changed thereafter. I don't know why I did. But I want to tell you, years later, I'm proud of that decision. I'm proud that I followed through when I felt like somebody was counting on me. To be invested in the success of other people is really rare. And I think that's why Paul has to explicitly state it, that we have to be called to look to the needs of others ahead of our own. Theologically, again, just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are in fact one body. And so, as we think about the body, the complete work of ministry that we're pursuing in our midst, I just want you to know that even if you're not involved personally in one of these particular ministries that are listed in our insert, this is a time for us to be invested in the success of one another. There's a lot here. There's a lot that you may not be passionate about. There's a lot that you may not discern the need for. But I would ask you to be on board with some of these ministries, maybe 3 or 4 over the next couple months, and to show up, to serve, to invest in the success of our community. Because there are people that attend this church, and whether you know them by name or not, are counting on you. That's what we're called to. Just this week, we have Trunk or Treat this coming Thursday. On account of that, we won't have our push event, so no need to sign up for that this week. But looking ahead to ministries that need a lot of volunteers, you can sign up for the spaghetti supper and the fish fry out in the narthex right there on a clipboard. Just as the community is one and has many members, and all the members of the community, though many, are one community. You see, we serve Calvert City, Kentucky. We serve the kingdom of God. We serve Marshall County, Kentucky. And in doing my paperwork and getting ready for Charge Conference this afternoon, I came across a mission statement. And I just want to encourage you that anytime a pastor comes to you, that you educate the pastor on what the mission statement is. If it means anything, I think that's the first thing the pastor needs to know. And this is what I found out that our mission statement is. We have it in abbreviated form right here, offering Christ, ... But what the ... stands for, at least in paperwork that I've found, you may need to correct me later on, our mission is to fulfill the Great Commission by offering Christ, building community, growing in grace, and serving with Christ in the church and in the world. We have people in our community who are invested in the success of our community just as we are. And I want you to hear from Crystal Byers, the director of the Family Resource Center, who is, like us, invested in the success of our community. Let's hear from her. 96 kids at 2 schools, one within a mile of here, need food. And because of your faithfulness and your commitment and your investing in one another's success, we'll see that happens when we raise funds. And indirectly, those funds are allocated towards kids who need food through the Family Resource Center and our raising funds of the Spaghetti Supper, November 7th. When we volunteer at a fish fry at a neighboring church, we invested in the success of our sister church and our veterans. Again, just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body. My prayer is, as I invite Beth and Hudson to come forward, my prayer for us is that we would be invested in the success of our community and our world. This is about all of us, not just one or two of us. This is the church.